Thank you so much for joining us for this week's Free Thursday webinar. I'm Nikki Jovicic from LookUpStrata, and I'm also the Managing Director of Tower Body Corporate in Queensland, and I'm your host. Charlie Richardson of NOX Energy and Jake Sharp from MiMOR are joining us today. This session is designed to equip strata communities with the knowledge needed to navigate the rapidly growing adoption of eMobility devices. We will address the key trends and considerations surrounding EVs, including clarifying implications for safety, insurance, and the current regulatory landscape. Jake and Charlie will discuss the various EV charging technologies during this webinar, outlining their suitability for strata buildings and associated costs, and we'll explore different approaches to implementing solutions and discuss the importance of factors like electricity supply and the need for residents' equal access to charging. So we aim to provide insights and strategies to help your strata scheme proactively prepare for the increasing demand for EV charging, ensuring a smooth transition towards a future with more e-mobility devices, which includes e-bikes and e-scooters, of course. LookUpStrata takes our transparency responsibilities seriously regarding our partnerships. So I'd like to mention that MiMOR is a long-time sponsor of LookUpStrata. And also, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the session, in addition to owning LookUpStrata, I also own Tower Body Corporate. Now, before we begin, I'd like to mention that the information in this session, including discussions arising from submitted questions and the chat conversation, is not advice and should not be relied upon as advice, and you should seek independent advice before acting on the information contained in the session. And we welcome back Jake Sharp, founder and director of MiMOR. While managing a large cleaning business, Jake noticed a communication gap between residents, committees and managers. Buildings with full-time managers had support, but smaller ones faced confusion. Strata managers and building managers were often overwhelmed with calls and emails from residents. To foster harmony, Jake created MiMOR, a simple yet effective software solution. And Jake now drives MiMOR's evolution, seeking collaborations to modernise property management. And we also welcome Charlie Richardson. So based in Melbourne and trained as a mechanical engineer, Charlie has over 25 years experience in the telecommunications, energy and EV sectors. Previously, the managing director of Accenture's $700 million utilities practice, and having founded and led Accenture's eMobility practice for Asia Pacific, he continues to engage in the net zero, peer-to-peer and eMobility sectors through advisory roles and as the managing director of Velocious Investments. He currently serves as the COO of NOX Energy and is focused on their intelligent power socket to make access to electric cars and charging fair and accessible for all Australians. So today we're really happy to welcome Jake and Charlie to today's session.
Thanks, Nikki. Well, I guess from my perspective and from me being in the industry for 20 plus years with the cleaning business and with MiMOR, I see it and I do a lot of Zooms and I meet a lot of owners and I've seen a lot of things. So I guess EV cars or charging has been a big issue in the last, let's say, 5 years. With new technology and companies creating solutions to issues, why can't home apartments be the same as homes? So I guess what I've seen over the past is people come to us and they say, oh, what about putting in a PowerPoint in my car spot because I've got tools and I'm a tradie. Can I charge them there? I don't want to take them upstairs. You know, lithium batteries, all of that stuff. And so the answer is generally no, and it has been for 20 years. So, you know, what about vacuuming my car? You know, what about I've got a bike and I want to charge the battery to my bike. And this is before EV. So this has been a question that's been coming up for a long, long time. And then obviously with the EV cars, EV scooters, you know, bikes and all of that, then obviously now it's taken it to its next level. So I guess, you know, we want to look at how we can future-proof buildings. For us, we get really excited with these new technologies that instead of saying no, they've said, well, hang on, what's the issue? We've found something that can solve it.
I appreciate the opportunity to speak about this. As mentioned, I'm trained as a mechanical engineer. I've been working with EVs for 25 years. And I think Jake kind of alluded to one of the things that I wanted to really touch on right at the beginning, which is we don't necessarily have an infrastructure problem when it comes to electric vehicles. There's electricity everywhere. When you go to whoop whoop, there's going to be power there. What really is a matter of what we need to consider is convenience. So is charging happening at the most convenient time when the vehicle is parked? whether that be an EV or a bike. And the second one is charge velocity. How fast are we charging this? So those two kind of go hand in hand. If it's going to be parked for a long period, obviously the velocity can be slower. If it's going to be parked for a short period, that velocity needs to be higher. But in short, there's electricity everywhere. It's just a matter of getting it into the either EV or the e-bike, e-scooter in the most effective way possible. So the first thing I wanted to touch on is a very busy slide, but I kind of wanted to wrap up everything with regards to safety, insurance, and regulation and adoption. So the first thing is EVs are coming. There are 14 new manufacturers that are coming this year alone. They have sub $30,000 models, and we expect to see sub $25,000 models by the end of this year. They're already over 10% of the new vehicle sales in 2025, and that's expected to triple by 2027. So in short, they're coming. The idea of price parity and the idea that an internal combustion engine or an ICE vehicle is less expensive than an EV has now been blown away in Australia. EVs are now at price parity or lower, and we expect them to drop precipitously and be cheaper than petrol and diesel vehicles in the very, very near term. We already see that with some models. Then the number one question I get asked is about safety. So with regards to safety, there's this perception that EVs catch fire. The facts are this. Since 2010, there have been 8 EV fires in Australia. They are well tracked and well documented. Almost all of them are related to external factors. A few are from arson. A few were from striking something at a high speed. We had one in Victoria last year, which was related to charging, and it wasn't the EV that caught fire. It was a cheap knockoff defective portable charger that caught fire, and the vehicle had a small bit of damage, but it didn't actually get into thermal runaway. I think the most important thing to take away here is that per the Australian Fire Association, there are an average of 7 petrol and diesel vehicle fires per day in Australia. So in one day, we've had almost as many EV fires as we've had since 2010. And I like to put that picture up there because that is from last week in Port Melbourne, my neighborhood. It's about 2 blocks from my house. It is a petrol Mercedes that caught fire on the street for no reason. Just parked and just caught fire. So this perception that EVs are an increased fire risk is factually incorrect and is backed up by data that says that just simply does not happen. Second one is insurance. So I get lots and lots of questions around, well, if we allow EV charging, what will happen to our policy? Will we be viewed at a higher risk? Are there considerations there? I have personally spent hours talking to the underwriters at CHU, because they're the largest strata insurer here in Australia, asking them these very specific questions. I want to understand. And per CHU and per every other insurance provider I've spoken to, the regulations around EV charging are this. There are no rate or risk changes whenever you allow EV charging in your OC or your building. The only regulations are just as if for anything else, which is that any work that's done needs to be done by a licensed contractor. It needs to be done to code. It needs to be done per the OC rules and the bylaws, and it needs to be safe. So it's no different than doing any other types of works in an OC. That the expectation it's going to be done properly and by licensed professionals. There are no regulations and there are no rate changes that are related to EV charging in OCs. And that's in any way, shape, or form, whether that's high speed charging or low speed. From a regulation standpoint, there's for new construction, there's the National Construction Code of 2022 came out. That dictates for new developments, multi-unit developments, essentially laying out the backbone. This is things like cable trays, load balancing, et cetera, for eventually 100% adoption in those buildings. It doesn't dictate power supply. It just indicates that you need to be able to load balance and you need to have the infrastructure that people can easily run power to their particular parking spot without necessarily having to go all the way back to the distribution board. From the fireys themselves, I have talked to innumerable fire services and tried to get clear definition on EV specific, not e-bike or e-scooter or tools, but EVs. I've had personal conversations. All of them have essentially said that we don't have a specific set of regulations or requirements around them. We generally have a set of guidance, and it's largely around those eMobility, those micro mobility devices. There are some things around, cord safety and keeping things out of the way, but generally there are no specific regulations. I've not found any by state or in any of my conversations with the fire services. From a charger perspective, it's really important to note there are different ways to charge an EV. There's one way is via a power point, so in general GPO. The other way is with a dedicated charger, which is those are what you normally see with a tethered cable and providing a higher velocity. Chargers have had regulations set since 2018. They are not mandatory right now, but they are still in the guidance phase. There is an expectation that within the next year that they'll make some updates to those because there's been a lot of changes since 2018. But again, those are only applicable to dedicated EV chargers. They don't apply to what we would call trickle or level 1 charging, where you're talking about a general power point. So what to take of all of this, right? It's a couple things. Number one, EVs are coming, and they're coming fast. You should expect 2 to 5% of your residents and every one of your properties will be adopting EVs each year, and that will only continue to grow. And the most important thing is that there aren't safety, insurance, or regulatory blockers to allowing EV charging in your strata properties. And then I think the third thing is, from a safety perspective, there's been no demonstrated evidence that EVs, and I keep emphasizing EVs, are an increased fire risk in any way, shape, or form. So I want everyone to just take a second to digest that, but really that's a lot of information, and a lot of the questions we received in advance were about these specific things. The nice thing is the answers are pretty black and white. If I go into the next one, I want to set a little bit of definition here because it'll help set the context for the rest of the conversation. There are 3 levels of charging: level 1, level 2, and level 3. Level 1 is typically called trickle charging. For those of you who know EVs, you generally get a portable charger. You plug it into a standard household power point, and it provides a low level of power to the vehicle. Interestingly, about 50% of between 40 and 50% of EV owners in Australia charge via this mechanism every single day. So they don't have a dedicated EV charger. The level 2 charger is what you think of most of the time when you think about a charger. This is going to be your Tesla device that we've got a picture of there. It's usually 7 to 22 kilowatts, and it puts somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 110 kilometers per hour. So these are typically installed in shared car parks, dedicated residences for people who own EVs, and you'll see slightly upgraded versions that are usually available as public chargers. And level 3 charging, these are your razzle-dazzle 15, 20-minute chargers that are at the likes of Ampol and BP. These are very expensive, very high velocity, but the idea is that they provide charging during the course of a journey. So, just like you stop for petrol during the course of a long trip, the same sort of thing here. You would stop and you would be there 15 to 20 minutes to top up your vehicle. You can see for suitability for strata buildings, we're really only talking about level 1 and level 2. And from a regulatory standpoint, level 1 chargers are not subject to any EV specific regulations. Level 2 are, and you can see some of the price point differentials there. So this is my favorite slide. Let's talk about how OCs are generally approaching EV charging and my little subtext of why they're generally bad. So there's really 5 ways. Number 1 is no way, no how. So no EV charging allowed. We just simply don't allow it. Now it's great because it's a really simple answer, and it completely takes any responsibility away from the OC. Now, the challenge with that is that there's legislation in both Victoria and New South Wales that essentially says that if the OC were to deny without a valid reason, it can be open for legal challenge. We've already seen some residents in Queensland who've threatened to go to the tribunal, and that's essentially gotten them the ability to be able to put in a charger. They've essentially gotten to the point where the OC was told that in no uncertain terms that they were going to have to expend a lot of money and a lot of time and effort by going to the tribunal, and they were unlikely to win. So in other words, it's absolutely an approach. It's not great for your residents, and ultimately we expect legal challenges and precedent to be set. Second one is, yeah, you want EV charging, fantastic. Figure out how to wire it back to your own meter. While that sounds great in theory, and in dense multi-unit properties, you're talking about now trying to wire back up multiple stories. Obviously, that has not everybody can do that. There's a huge amount of expense. And the most important thing on this is that just because you're wiring back to an individual residence meter doesn't mean you don't have impact on the entire property. I've got a great example on the outskirts of Victoria. We've got a set of townhomes where two people put in high-speed EV charging and one person put in a hot tub. When all three of those kick on, it trips the entire 15 units. So while those Sparkies and those residents took consideration for their individual meters, they are on a common power supply. So the OC has to account for that. My personal building in Melbourne has a few 32 amp high-speed chargers, and based on the available power supply, they could only add a few more before we'd potentially be tripping the entire 450 units in my building. So while that seems like a great, hands-off approach, it still doesn't account for the fact that you've got common power supply going into the building, even if the meters or even if the charger is wired directly to a resident's meter. Now, third one is, how about some shared chargers? This is a great way. We put some shared chargers in the visitor car park, and everyone's happy. We get the EV people, happy. We're good. We're covered for forever. Good news is you're going to get some higher speed charging, usually some nice level 2 chargers. The bad news is that inevitably, and we've seen this where there's been any level of adoption of EVs, is that you've now taken away visitor car park amenity, because who parks in those would be your residents who have EVs. You're now asking, those chargers are typically pretty fast, which means that the vehicle will be filled in 2 to 4 hours. People don't move their vehicle once they're home. So now your property manager has become a parking cop and is now putting notes on windshields and putting in booking systems. And now you're navigating that whole process with your residents who are complaining because there's 4 chargers and Jake leaves his Tesla parked there overnight. Right? So it's really not a great approach because it's not scalable. It takes away amenity with that visitor car park, and it puts an onus on your property manager that they just simply don't want to do. There's enough challenges managing a strata property. The last thing they want to do is be a parking cop too. And ultimately, with the limited number of chargers, you're going to get overwhelmed. Okay, number 4, let's go for this, right? And I'm sure some of you have seen some of this. You've gotten quotes. Let's get the infrastructure and the backbone in to do level 2 charging for everyone. It's going to be very expensive, and it's going to, but has a great benefit for everyone. My building alone was quoted $300,000 to just put the backbone in for this kind of thing before a single charger was installed, and that's a pretty common theme. I have a building that is just down the street that spent $250,000 on 5 shared chargers, but same sort of principle here. They built that big backbone. Now, while that sounds good in theory, the challenge is that putting in all this infrastructure doesn't change the available supply to the building. A level 2 charger is going to demand at least 7 kilowatts, which for a single phase charger, which is a lot of power. And in very short order, that load balancing that you've had to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for as a backbone is going to kick in, and it's going to ramp down the available power to all those very fancy level 2 chargers. And what that means is that you're going to be getting significantly less power than that level 2 charger is rated for, simply because they can't draw anymore. So when you have enough simultaneous chargers going, there'll be quite a bit less power available. As I mentioned before, I've got a building nearby me. They put 5 shared chargers in, very nice level 2 chargers, load balanced. When all 5 are running, you get 15 amps of power, which is the equivalent of a household power point, which means they spend all that money, and when all 5 are being utilized, they're doing no better than if they plugged into a wall socket. So ultimately, it's while it's great to build that infrastructure, unless you're going to spend upwards of $1 million to increase the electricity supply to your building, all that infrastructure will largely be for naught once you have some scale. And then the last one, I couldn't figure out a funny quip here, but essentially it's the panic mode. Holy smokes, as Jake mentioned, someone's got an extension lead and they are the guy with the Tesla stealing power. Turn off all the power points. Whole parking garage. No power points are going to be active. Almost every building I walk into now has all power points disabled for this very reason. It definitely saves the OC money from stolen power and improves safety. You don't want people dragging extension leads. Extension leads are not rated for this sort of thing, and they're just dangerous in general. But it obviously is taking away amenity. Those power points are there for a reason, for both maintenance and for residents. So, there's got to be a better option here. And it can't just be, we're just going to turn off all the power and just stick our head in the sand. And this is where I think traditionally OCs have not examined this option. And that is number 6, which is a load balanced level 1 power point in every car park. I call it the Oprah solution because everyone gets a power point. The pros on this are it's very versatile, meaning a power point can be used for anything, whether it's charging your tools, your bike, your EV, or whatever, or vacuuming your car. They generally don't require much the actual hardware for infrastructure upgrades, because most of the load balancing can be done via the cloud. We can rotate power between those devices as demand necessitates. Now, the con on that is you're going to get slower charging speed. And as we referenced in the previous slide, typically these are going to give you 12 to 20 kilometers per hour. Now, the key thing on that is the average Australian drives 37 kilometers a day, which means if you have the lowest velocity in there at 10 amps, you're going to fill up your car in approximately 3 hours. And most vehicles are parked 94% of their life, and most of the time they're parked at their home location. So if you think overnight charging, every day you would go out and your vehicle would be full. So those are the 5 historical options. And number 6 is one that we're really advocating for OCs to start considering. This is what Jake referenced. How do we solve the problem of not spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on infrastructure that ultimately will be for naught, because once we have some scale, all the power gets turned down? And how do we make sure that charging is as convenient and easy as possible, and we're not taking away amenity or putting more responsibility onto the property manager or the OC? So I wanted to show a typical level 1 charging model. So I've referenced ourselves and 2 of our other competitors. So I'm from NOX, Alchemy Charge, and Ready Steady Plug. So it works like this. There's a common meter on the OC. The power points are wired into that common meter, not into the residence meter. And as the resident wants to use that power, they scan and they pay for that power at time of consumption. And then ultimately, and they're paying the strata rates, plus usually a very small tariff charged by ourselves or Alchemy or Ready Steady Plug. So usually a couple cents on top of that. But the stratas themselves can't charge more than the rates. But by law, they're not allowed to be a for-profit enterprise. So whatever rates they're paying for their electricity would be passed through to the EV owner, which are usually pretty advantageous, especially the off-peak hours at 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., which is when most people would be charging anyway. So what will happen is the EV owner would scan, start the session, pay for all all energy consumed, and then the vendor themselves, the charge point operator, us or Alchemy or Ready, would then reimburse the OC for all energy consumed. And they provide full transparency on this, but essentially it'll be a P times Q. X number of kilowatts were used, at X rate, whether that be a time of use or a flat rate, and all the money just gets direct deposited into the OC accounts every month or every quarter, depending on their billing cycle. But the OC is never out of pocket. The thing is that on all energy that's consumed is paid for by the people that are using it, and it's paid for at the same rate that the strata is paying for it. So it's really important that it's equitable and it's really, really low cost. Generally, what you'll find is that it'll be anywhere from 30 to 50% cheaper than what they would pay for public charging, which is great. It's an excellent amenity. And really interesting, it presents a way for those stratas with solar to self-consume. So as a little sidebar here, those of you that live in buildings with solar probably overproduce and probably see that you're getting next to nothing for your solar feed-in. Well, with this, it presents a way to encourage residents to charge while they're doing work from home, or the couple days a week that they're based at home, or during the weekend, and to self-consume that solar. And the strata is able to charge that at their retail rates, but for all intents and purposes, it's free to them. So it's a really good way to help monetize that solar and help with the payback period. It's much better than trying to feed it into the grid and getting 0 or 3 cents for each kilowatt. But all information is visible, charging sessions, how long, how much, to both the resident and to the OC. It's all very, very transparent. So let's talk about considerations. So if I'm sitting on an OC, here are the things that I think about. Number one, level 2 charging is not your only option. Historically, that's been what's been quoted and what's been what people have been expecting when we talk about EV charging. Level 1 charging via a typical power point is a lot more versatile and a lot more scalable. So I'd say consider that, not just level 2. The next one is load management's a must. So it doesn't matter whether you're talking about level 2 or level 1. I simply cannot, I've not seen a strata in the entirety of all of my work that has enough power supply to put a 10 amp power point in every one of the car parks and not overwhelm the infrastructure. So you're going to have some level of load management. And that could be hardware based on site, which is generally pretty expensive and associated with level 2, or that could be cloud based where you've got rotating power supply between devices. The one thing I would be really cautious of if I sit on an OC is no first in, first out. So some of the load balancing works on a first in, first out premise, which is that if you can simultaneously support, say, 5 devices running, and that 6th person comes in and plugs in, they won't get power until someone either disconnects or completes their charge, which could be hours, especially if you're talking about a level 1 charge. That's simply not fair or equitable. So we always say when you're considering load management, make sure that it's using a round robin style, time-based, so that if you're plugged in, you're getting power. It may be portions of an hour, but you're getting power at a relatively steady rate and not necessarily sitting plugged in for hours and not getting any. That will inevitably cause huge problems with your residents. Next one is communication. So all of these devices, level 2, level 1, requires some level of comms. The more sophisticated level 2 ones will usually use a proper Ethernet cable. Most of the others will use a Wi-Fi network. So if you don't have a Wi-Fi network, it is going to have to be something that is invested in. Interestingly, like for some of our clients, the Wi-Fi network is not a huge expense, usually a couple $1,000s for several hundred car parks. And what we generally do is we can incorporate that into the tariff that the residents pay and recover that cost so that it's actually free for the OC. They don't have to front to that money because the cost is usually generally pretty low. The nice thing about having a Wi-Fi network is it also gives your property manager and your residents something to build off of should they ever need to add any smart devices. Those could be smoke detectors, air quality, cameras, motion detectors, lights. Having a network across your garage presents a lot of really good opportunity for security upgrades and just keeping an eye on things. So the nice thing is that like our device uses 3 meg of data a day, which is about the equivalent of 3 emails. So these devices are not like our devices and all our competitors are not data intensive, which means you've got a lot of bandwidth for other products in there. Next one, cable trays. If you've got them, good on you, lucky you. But you need to have cable trays for a scaled implementation. You simply cannot run enough conduit. It becomes very costly, and honestly, you start to have a bit of a spaghetti situation on your ceilings and your walls. You need to have cable trays to be able to route power off of for the actual charger installation. Next one, OC control. So we talked earlier about what happens when you say no or you say yes, but you can only wire it to the residence meter. The OC is essentially relinquishing control, which is going to come back and bite them. So deciding what you're going to do, what products you're going to allow, what the process is going to be for getting them installed is really important. Don't try to advocate that responsibility to somebody else or to the residents themselves. Set some parameters and make sure that you retain that control and that it's not going to overwhelm the infrastructure of the building. Last one, or second to last one, electricity supply is the boss. So you can only do what you can do with the available power that you have. Power upgrades to a building usually start in the neighborhood of $750,000. That's the cheapest I've ever seen. Generally, they run well over $1 million, which means they're almost entirely cost prohibitive and they're not going to happen. So whatever you do, you have to recognize that whatever power you have, how you allocate that among your residents, that's really going to be your limiting factor. Newer buildings generally have more power, but older buildings will have available power for this, but that ultimately is your critical path and your limiting factor. And I haven't forgotten, I know there are lots of questions about e-bikes and e-scooters. So I inevitably walk these garages with OCs and property managers. And I get told that, what about e-bikes and e-scooters? And we've banned them, we don't allow them. And I poke my head into the nearest bike cage and there's always 3 or 4 e-bikes or e-scooters right there. So obviously the ban is not working. And unless you're willing to employ a security guard to stand at every one of your doors and prevent people from bringing in these devices, you're not going to be able to stop it. So the approach I always suggest is more carrot, less stick. So you're not going to stop these devices coming in. So you need to do 2 things. Number 1 is you need to let the residents know that any fire that results because of these is their responsibility. So that is to discourage people from buying super cheap, non-legal versions from Temu or whomever, or illegally modifying their own legal version to make it go faster or whatever. So don't do that, because those devices, those are the ones that generally catch fire. And then the second one, so making residents aware of their responsibility. And the second one is encourage people to charge in the safest place possible. And the safest place possible is going to be the garage, where you have active fire suppression. You've got a concrete box that has very little that can catch fire. And it's honestly the most convenient. So we always encourage OCs to consider just putting in charge points into the bike cages and making them free. Now, I know every OC cringes at the word free, but you're talking about tens, maybe $100 or $200 a year, but a huge risk mitigation. So if you make it super easy for people to charge their e-bikes or e-scooters in the garage in situ, in that concrete box with the fire suppression, they will do it. They're not going to want to drag those up to their apartment, and it makes the whole building a lot safer. So, but my general things on e-bikes and e-scooters are, you're not going to be able to stop them. Residents need to be made aware of their responsibility in the event of a fire, particularly for those that decide that they're going to illegally modify or buy super cheap, non-regulated versions online. And the third one is make it super easy for them to charge in the safest place they can, which is always going to be the garage. And then last one, what options do OCs have? So I kind of want to put a table up here, and I know there's a lot of information. So we've talked about level 1 and level 2 charging and about the rates that with those charge and the regulations. Generally, here are your differences. Level 2 is going to have a hardware-based, on-site hardware-based load balancing, and it's going to be dynamic, and it's going to take advantage of every available kilowatt you've got. Level 1 is going to be cloud-based, and it's going to be set thresholds, and it's not going to take advantage of every bit of power you've got. The base cost of charging is always going to be the OC Energy rates, because they, by law, they cannot charge more. They can't seek out a profit. From a resident cost for hardware and installation, you're generally looking at $500 to $1,000, maybe a bit more, depending on the challenge of installation for level 1 and the scale. And for level 2, you're looking at anywhere from $2,000 to $5,000. For the ongoing tariffs, so on top of those OC Energy rates, what the residents are going to be looking at is somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 10 cents per kilowatt for every charging event they have. For level 2, generally you see 20 to 40 cents. So it's quite a bit more, and that's generally because these are much more complicated devices. That tariff is meant to cover warranty and maintenance work, and they're just a lot more complicated, and they require a lot more servicing. OC upfront costs, we talked about Wi-Fi, cable trays. Those are generally going to be required for either. And then if you are talking about a level 2 solution, many of you have probably already gotten quotes for your OC. And you're usually talking in the neighborhood of a couple $100,000 for that backbone when you add in all the cable trays and the load balancing hardware. OC ongoing costs. Generally, there's none with a level 1 solution, because all the costs are borne by the resident who's using the charger or using the power point. And for the level 2, usually you've got a subscription charge per for the hardware, and then you usually have a per charger cost per year as well, another subscription. So there's an expense associated with that. Talked about Australian vendors. There's really only 3 of us in the level 1 space in Australia, and that's NOX, my company NOX, Alchemy, and Ready Steady Plug. And all of us have been around NOX since late 2023. Alchemy, I think, is 21, and Ready Steady Plug is middle of last year. Level 2, you probably would have heard of some of these companies: JetCharge, ChargeFox, EVSE. All of them have well-established entities here in Australia and can provide any of these services, and have for some buildings. So at a summary level, what you're talking about is level 2 is going to have the benefit of faster charging, but it's much more expensive up front and ongoing. And when you have some scale, it's going to be ramped down based on, but going to be load balanced down because of the available power supply to your building. Level 1, going to be slower, but as I mentioned earlier, the average Australian drives 37 kilometers a day. It will more than meet those needs, and it doesn't have all the regulatory regime that goes along with EV charging hardware. It's simply viewed as a power point, whether that be 10 or 15 amps. So it's the exact same regulatory regime. And I think that is it for me.
From a resident perspective, to have your building management software system in there, and if it can talk, then there'll be a wallet, they put the money in, then they can charge, and it takes it out, and obviously then it is visible to the strata managers. They know how much energy, who's used it, the money that comes in and goes out, and all of that. So yeah, that from a resident's point of view, I want to say just that it can be really easy when you add these into a building.
Okay, Jake, so you're saying you've got some sort of a front of house software like MiMOR, or there are other softwares that different buildings have got, and systems like Charlie's mentioned can be implemented into that one app, and then it makes it really easy for the resident just to have that one app on their phone that will do this for them.
Yeah, that's right. And as Charlie said, if you put Wi-Fi, because there's going to be other new products, access control for the garage door, you want to connect that, you've already got the Wi-Fi. The same thing. If you're going to have, or even if you're going to have electric bollards where the EV charging days are, that's on your app. So I'm going to book the EV charging because it's a bay. I've booked it for next Tuesday, for 3 hours. Bang, done, and you've got the one app. So there could be access, it could be charging, it could be bollards, it can be who knows what else what other issues that are building, who's going to come up with the next thing. So yeah, it's really important that buildings, complexes, townhouses, they use the one software front of house system, and they integrate with companies like NOX and all these other companies. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. All right, wonderful. Well, thanks, Charlie, too, for your presentation. Lots of comments in there saying how wonderful it was. What would you suggest for parking areas which are open or insecure, which can allow public access? Is there a solution for that?
So my building actually has both a garage and an open. I actually park in an open area, so there are options. So whether that be, you can actually mount a PowerPoint on. We've got one installation that's actually hanging from a chain, and it is by law. It is within a building, and that is legal. I've astonished, but is fine. So whether that be bollards or mounting to any semi-permanent structure is okay. With regards to open air or open access, our devices can either be owned by the individual resident, or if they and they can allow public access, meaning anyone can come up and scan it, or you can restrict access to only a certain number of profiles. And most everybody's app will do that. You can associate it with a particular device and say only these people can access this device. We do the same sort of thing for like commercial installations where businesses have public parking areas that are open. They don't want the guy down the street using it overnight to charge his Tesla. So, or maybe they want to charge him but not charge their employees. We can set all that up in the back end.
Or even I guess a short stay guest that's coming for 2 days, give them access.
In my building, about 85% of the car park spots have a great, like there's a structure nearby that we can mount to. There are about 15% that are in the middle that, but don't let those outliers be the exception that prevents the whole adoption. We'll figure out something for them. And generally we try to do that in an equitable way.
Excellent. Thank you. That sounds great. We've installed cable racks in our car parks to facilitate future installation of EV car charging hardware in individual lot owners' car spaces, i.e. cable into distribution boards. Having checked we have sufficient switchboard capacity for a number of slow chargers, how can we best explore charger hardware, current management software and recharging software in the future should a lot owner wish to install a charger?
Well, if that was my building, I would suggest that you don't, I mean, doesn't even really matter on the size of the building. I would be looking at level 1 charging because it'll be the most scaled. Ourselves, Alchemy Charge, both of them will be provided a solution that the resident would simply wire in, pay for an install device, and then ourselves, Alchemy Charge, whomever, would be setting the thresholds based on the available power, both at a circuit level and at a site level, and would rotate and load balance the power between it. So that is going to be your fastest, lowest cost, most scalable solution, and easiest and most versatile. You can absolutely go look at the level 2 chargers too, but again, unless you have an absolutely enormous amount of power and you have a lot of residents who demand to be able to charge in an hour or two, it's really going to be a lot of wasted infrastructure and spend, and a huge amount of time and cost.
Wi-Fi is problematic in most basement car parks. I know you spoke about this in some detail in one of the slides, but another option is power line signaling using the connectivity of the power cables.
Yeah, I mean, our device has Wi-Fi, Ethernet, RFID, so little chips you usually get to get in and out of your building, and it has Bluetooth. Our preferred method is always going to be Wi-Fi. It's much lower cost and much faster and a lot more versatility. We generally build out the networks for our clients too, because we want some visibility. Because to be very candid, it's not our devices that fail. Our devices have a 30-year lifespan. It's a GPO, right? It's a really smart GPO. What does happen is the Wi-Fi networks. So absolutely right, Wi-Fi networks can be bad. We do a ton of testing to ensure that we have solid connectivity, and we do a lot of monitoring of the network itself. The second part of that is the mobile connectivity. Everyone goes to the basement, they'd have zero reception. That's why our device has Bluetooth, so that you can initiate a charging session even if your device doesn't have any mobile reception. So it's a really good differentiator. Not all products offer that, but we're really adamant about it because we don't want people in the basement trying to initiate a session and unable to get started.
Okay, that's great. And we're quickly running out of time, but I just might mention one thing. We had a very quick conversation about this, Charlie, before we went on air, but we've had a comment come in from a gentleman. If I can just grab chat for a second. Bob was saying, check out the New South Wales EV Ready building grant programs and subsidies and the cost of system installation. And you were mentioning there are other very similar, in other states, similar programs available too. And could you just give us a really quick overview of that before we finish?
Yeah, there's a lot of grant programs, usually at the state and some at the council level, that are for for that infrastructure. So when we talk about cable trays, distribution board upgrades, et cetera, sometimes shared chargers, there are loads of programs out there. There's no way I could get into all of them. There are a lot at the local level that I'm not even aware of, but they're a great way to help mitigate some of that cost for that infrastructure, because you get a chicken and the egg thing. If you've got a 200 unit building, but only 12 EV drivers, how do you balance who pays for cable trays? Even recognizing that it is a good upgrade for the building. So these are good ways to offset some of that infrastructure costs, not necessarily give residents free chargers. We still think residents themselves should pay for their individual chargers, and there are ways to do that for us, Alchemy Charge is a relatively low cost solutions.
Okay, wonderful. All right, that's great. Well, as we're coming up to the end of the session, we always like to check back in with our presenters and just ask for any final wrap-ups or thoughts that you'd like to leave us with. So, Jake, I might go to you first.
It's happening. It's coming. Younger kids are using EV scooters. They're not even doing a skateboard like I did anymore. So we've got to embrace it. It might change a little bit, but let's protect the building complex. Let's offer them a solution. Let's put charging bays in basements. It's better to have a fire in a basement than a fire in an apartment. So I guess from my perspective and the technology, let's make it easy for residents to use. And you say EV and people say no straight away. It's like, well, hang on, let's talk about it. Let's look at what is out there that has improved, that solved it, and then how do we make the building a lot safer?
And Charlie, I'll just ask you for your final thoughts.
Look at this as an opportunity, right? This is a way to provide amenity to your existing residents, increase your value, increase your rental yield for very little cost. I can guarantee you 2 apartments next door to each other that have the exact same outlook and the exact same footprint. One that has a power point in its car park and is EV charging ready versus one that doesn't is going to be more desirable, sell for higher, and rent for more. So think about it as an opportunity to upgrade your apartment for a really, really low cost. So I think, there's a way to look at it as opposed to just trying to meet the needs of the existing EV drivers. What about the future? How are you future-proofing your apartment? Just like you would for upgrading windows or doors or internet access or anything else. And I think that's another way to take the approach as opposed to just going, how do I provide charging for those EV owners?
If you gained value from this video, please hit like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you're looking for information about parking, strata insurance, defects and more, head over to lookupstrata.com.au or sign up to our free weekly newsletter via the link in the description box below.